June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. The greatest invasion in history is underway, but just days later, the Allied advance grinds to a complete halt. The enemy wasn't superior tanks or artillery, it was just bushes. These weren't garden hedges, but ancient, impenetrable barriers of earth, stone, and tangled roots. Natural fortresses that turned every American Sherman tank into a death trap. Every time a tank tried to climb one, its vulnerable belly armor was exposed for an easy German kill shot. The invasion was failing, dead in the water. But one man refused to accept defeat. A sergeant with no engineering degree, just a blowtorch, a mountain of scrap metal from German beach obstacles, and a crazy idea. His name was Curtis Cullen. What he built in 48 hours would not only save the Normandy campaign, but it would literally change tank warfare forever. General Eisenhower himself was so impressed he ordered 5,000 copies made immediately. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The incredible true story of how a mad mechanic, a single broken tank, and an ingenious invention so simple, it was brilliant, saved D-Day. Stay until the end, because the incredible thing that happened to Sergeant Cullen 4 months later will shock you. 1. The Nightmare of the Bocage. Normandy, France, June 1944. 6 days after the D-Day landings and the Allied advance had ground to a complete halt. Not because of German panzers, not because of heavy artillery, but because of hedgerows. These weren't the decorative hedges you might have in your backyard. Norman hedgerows, known as bocage, were ancient barriers. They were thick, tangled walls of earth, stone, and roots that farmers had built over centuries to mark property boundaries. They were monsters. Some were 15 feet tall and just as thick. The roots went down 10 feet or more. They were natural fortresses that covered Normandy like a maze. For American tank crews, these hedgerows became death traps. Every time a Sherman tank tried to climb over a hedgerow, its thin belly armor would be exposed, the most vulnerable part of the entire vehicle. German soldiers, positioned on the other side with anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust, would simply wait. The moment a Sherman's underside appeared, they'd fire. One shot, one kill, over and over again. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron watched this nightmare unfold daily. He'd see tanks approach a hedgerow, tilt up as they tried to climb, and then erupt in flames. The crews rarely survived. The medics were overwhelmed. The tactical situation was desperate. Allied planners had expected to be 30 miles inland by now, pushing toward Paris. Instead, they were stuck, advancing only a few hundred yards per day. Every field was a separate battle. Every hedgerow was a new problem. The Germans didn't need massive reinforcements. They just needed to wait behind these natural barriers and pick off American armor as it exposed itself. 2. The idea of the mad mechanic. Cullen was not an engineer. He had no college education. Before the war, he'd been a mechanic in New Jersey, fixing cars and trucks. But he understood machines. He understood leverage and force. As he watched yet another Sherman burn, something clicked in his mind. The problem wasn't the hedgerows themselves. The problem was the tanks were trying to go over them instead of through them. If you could somehow cut through the hedgerow at ground level, plow through it rather than climb it, the tank would never expose its vulnerable belly armor. The Germans couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. But how do you cut through 10 feet of compacted earth, stone, and roots? These hedgerows had withstood centuries of weather. They weren't going to yield to anything short of massive force applied in exactly the right way. Cullen started sketching ideas in a notebook. His crewmates thought he was crazy. "Cullen's at it again," they'd joke. "He's gonna solve the whole war with his little drawings." There was an edge to the humor. A lot of smart people had looked at the hedgerow problem. None had solved it. What made one sergeant think he could do better? Clan ignored the skepticism. He'd learned long ago that people underestimated mechanics. They assumed that because you worked with your hands, you didn't work with your mind. But every good mechanic was a problem solver. Every repair was a puzzle. The hedgerows were just another kind of stubborn machinery. They had to be persuaded, that's all. And Cullen thought he knew how. He just needed a broken tank, some scrap metal, and permission from an officer crazy enough to let him try. 3. The insane proposal. Sergeant Cullen approached his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, with a proposal that sounded absolutely insane. He wanted to take a damaged Sherman tank, one that was still mobile, and weld steel prongs to its front. These prongs, made from German anti-tank obstacles called CZEK hedgehogs scattered all over the Normandy beaches, would act like giant knives. The tank would ram into the hedgerows at full speed, and the prongs would dig in and RIP through the earth and roots, creating a path. Captain Morrison stared at Cullen like he'd lost his mind. "Let me understand this, Sergeant. You want to take a tank that's already been shot at, weld scrap metal to it, and then deliberately drive it full speed into a solid earthen wall. That's your plan?" "Yes, sir," Cullen replied calmly. "The current plan is to drive tanks over hedgerows where they get shot in the belly. My plan keeps the armor facing the enemy at all times. The Germans can't penetrate frontal armor. They need the belly shot. If we never give them that shot, they can't kill the tank." Morrison was silent for a long moment. The logic was sound, but the plan was still crazy. Welding modifications to tanks in a combat zone using untested equipment in battle. If it failed, good tanks and crews would be lost. "How long would it take to build this thing?" Morrison asked. "Give me 2 days, some welding equipment, and permission to scavenge metal from the beach obstacles. I'll have a prototype ready." Morrison made a decision that would change the course of the Normandy campaign. "You have 48 hours. If this doesn't work, we are both going to be explaining ourselves to some very angry generals." 4. The tusks of the rhino. Cullen saluted and got to work immediately. He requisitioned welding equipment and a work crew. Then he headed to the beaches where the initial D-Day landings had taken place. Those beaches were now littered with German defensive obstacles. The very obstacles that were supposed to stop Allied landing craft had now become scrap metal waiting to be repurposed. The Jack Hedgehogs were perfect for Cullen's purpose. These were steel anti-tank obstacles made of 3 heavy iron beams welded together, weighing hundreds of pounds. The Germans had planted thousands of them on the beaches. Cullen and his crew cut the hedgehogs apart with torches, working through the night. They trimmed the steel beams to the right length, about 4 feet long. They sharpened the tips. They reinforced the welds. By the end of the first day, they had 4 prongs ready, each one thick as a man's leg and hard as a railroad track. The next phase was more delicate. They had to weld these prongs to the front of a Sherman tank without compromising the tank's structural integrity. Cullen calculated angles and positions carefully. The prongs had to be low enough to dig into the base of the hedgerows, spaced wide enough to rip through a broad section, and strong enough to withstand the impact without snapping off. "You really think this will work?" asked Private Eddie Kowalski, one of the welders. "I know it'll work," Clan replied, adjusting his welding mask. "The physics are solid, steel teeth driven by 30 tons of tank hitting earth and roots. Something's got to give, and it won't be the steel." By dawn on the second day, the modification was complete. The Sherman tank now had 4 steel prongs extending from its front, like the tusks of some mechanical beast. Soldiers gathered to look at the strange creation. Some were impressed, others were skeptical. More than a few took bets on whether Cullen would be court-martialed or commended. "Looks like a pig trying to mate with a porcupine," one soldier joked. Clan patted the steel prong affectionately. "Maybe so, but this pig's about to root through every hedgerow between here and Berlin." Captain Morrison walked around the modified tank, examining the welds. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Sergeant. You've built your mad contraption. Now you need to prove it works. Tomorrow morning, we're going to find a nice thick hedge and see if this thing is genius or suicide." 5. The test of fire, genius or suicide. That night, Cullen couldn't sleep. He ran through the calculations in his head, over and over. The math worked. The engineering was sound, but there was a difference between theory and reality. What if the prongs snapped on impact? What if they dug in too deep and the tank got stuck? What if the whole crazy contraption just made things worse? But he thought about those burning Shermans, those crews who never made it out. He thought about how the hedgerows were turning Normandy into a graveyard for American armor. Something had to change. If his idea worked, it could save hundreds of lives. Tomorrow would tell. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Cullen's modified Sherman rolled toward a particularly thick hedgerow, a beast of a barrier, 12 feet high, ancient and impenetrable looking. Several officers had gathered to watch. The Sherman's crew had volunteered for the test. As they buttoned up the hatches and the engine rumbled to life, the gathered soldiers fell silent. Cullen stood with the observers, his heart pounding. Everything he'd built came down to the next 60 seconds. Morrison raised his arm, then dropped it, the signal to proceed. The Sherman's engine roared louder. Black smoke belched from its exhaust. Then, with gathering speed, it charged directly at the hedgerow. 30 tons of steel accelerating toward an immovable object. The impact was thunderous. The entire tank shuddered. Earth exploded outward. Roots snapped with sounds like rifle shots. For a moment, the tank seemed to stall, embedded in the hedgerow's mass. Soldiers held their breath. Then, slowly at first, the Sherman began to move forward. The steel prongs were working. They were digging deep into the ancient earthwork, creating leverage, ripping through roots and stone. The tank tilted forward slightly, not exposing its belly, but maintaining a nose-down attitude that kept frontal armor facing any potential threat. More roots snapped. Dirt cascaded off the tank's hull. The engine screamed with effort. And then, suddenly, the Sherman burst through the other side of the hedgerow, emerging into the field beyond. The tank had created a perfect breach, wide enough for other vehicles to follow, low enough that the tank's vulnerable underside had never been exposed. The soldiers erupted in cheers. Cullen felt his knees go weak with relief. It had worked. His crazy idea had actually worked. The Sherman's crew popped their hatches, grinning. "That was the smoothest hedgerow crossing I've ever experienced," Corporal Mitchell shouted. "We barely felt the impact inside, and we never once exposed our belly to enemy fire." Major Williams approached Cullen, his expression serious. "Sergeant, how many of these modifications can you produce and how quickly?" "Sir, if I get enough welders and access to more hedgehog obstacles, my crew could modify 10 tanks a day. Maybe more if we really push it." "Not good enough," Williams said, and Cullen's heart sank. Then the major smiled. "I'm going to get you 50 welders and all the steel you need. I want 100 tanks modified by the end of the week, and I'm sending a report to General Bradley immediately. This invention is going to change everything." Captain Morrison clapped Cullen on the back. "Congratulations, Sergeant. You are no longer the mad mechanic. You are the genius mechanic who just saved the Normandy campaign." But Cullen wasn't celebrating yet. "Sir, with respect, one successful test doesn't mean it'll work in combat. We need to try this against an actual German position with real enemy fire. That's the only way to know if it's truly effective." Morrison nodded grimly. "I thought you might say that. There's a German strongpoint about 2 miles from here. They've been holding up our advance for 3 days. If your modification works there, under fire, it'll prove your concept beyond any doubt." "When do we go, sir?" "Tomorrow at dawn. You'll ride with Mitchell's crew as the technical advisor. If there are problems, you need to be there to see them and understand why." Cullen swallowed hard. He needed to see his invention in actual combat. Only then could he honestly say it was ready for mass production. "Understood, sir. I'll be ready." 6. The rhinoceros in combat. Dawn broke over Normandy with a cold drizzle that made everything gray and miserable. Cullen climbed into the Sherman tank, now nicknamed the Rhinoceros, taking position in the commander's cupola where he could observe. His stomach churned with nervous energy. The plan was straightforward. The Rhinoceros would lead a small column toward the German strongpoint. They'd use the hedgerow cutter to breach barriers that had previously stopped all advances. Infantry would follow close behind, using the breaches to advance without being caught in the killing zones the Germans had established. "Mount up," came the order. Engines rumbled to life. The Rhinoceros shuddered and began rolling forward, its steel prongs gleaming wetly in the dawn light. They approached the first hedgerow. Beyond it, according to intelligence, was a German machine gun nest that had been mowing down American infantry for days. The usual tactic would be to try climbing over, exposing the tank's belly to a German Panzerfaust. "Steady," Cullen said over the intercom. "Hit it at a slight angle, about 20 degrees. That'll help the prongs bite in." "Roger that," Corporal Mitchell replied. The impact came with a bone-jarring crash. Earth and roots exploded around them. Inside the tank, the crew was thrown forward, but nothing broke. The prongs held. The tank pushed forward, engines screaming, tracks churning, ripping through centuries-old growth. And then they were through, emerging on the other side to find a shocked German machine gun crew scrambling for their weapon. The Sherman's main gun spoke first. One high-explosive round eliminated the threat before the Germans could react. "It works!" Private Chen shouted over the intercom. "It actually works in combat!" But there was no time to celebrate. More hedgerows lay ahead. The rhinoceros continued its advance, breaching barrier after barrier. Each time the prongs performed perfectly. Each time the tank emerged before the Germans could bring anti-tank weapons to bear. The infantry following behind the rhinoceros were ecstatic. For the first time since D-Day, they could advance without being pinned down by hedgerow defenses. Then came the real test. Intelligence had warned them about a German Panther tank, a far more dangerous opponent than infantry, positioned behind a particularly massive hedgerow. The Panther's 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at long range. If the rhinoceros got stuck breaching the hedgerow, they'd be a sitting duck. "Contact!" Gunner Harrison called out. "Panther, partial cover behind the hedgerow." Cullen's mind raced. They could retreat, call for artillery, play it safe. But that's what the old tactics would have been. The whole point of his invention was to change the rules. "Breach the hedgerow," Cullen ordered. "Don't stop for anything. We go through fast. We emerge with our gun already aimed where that Panther is. Speed is our advantage." Mitchell didn't hesitate. The Sherman surged forward. The impact was massive. This hedgerow was thicker than any they'd hit yet. For a terrifying moment, the tank seemed to slow, the prongs struggling against the dense mass. "More power!" Cullen shouted. "Give it everything!" The engine howled, smoke poured from the exhausts, and inch by inch, the rhinoceros forced its way through. They burst through the hedgerow. Harrison had kept his gun trained, and as they emerged, there it was, the Panther, its turret still turning to track their unexpected appearance. Harrison fired first. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side armor, thinner than its frontal armor, and penetrated. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches. Its crew bailed out, and the rhinoceros machine guns persuaded them to surrender rather than fight. Cullen climbed out of the tank, his legs shaky. He'd done it. The design worked, not just in a controlled test, but in actual combat against real enemy positions, under fire. Captain Morrison arrived shortly after, his radio crackling with reports from other units. "Sergeant, I just got word from Division. General Bradley himself wants to see you." Apparently, Major Williams's report made quite an impression. They're calling your invention the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter, and they want 5,000 of them manufactured immediately. 5,000. Cullen could barely process the number. His little modification, built in 48 hours from scrap metal, was going to be mass-produced and deployed across the entire Allied armored force. "Sir, I'm just a mechanic. I'm not sure I should be—" "You are the man who solved the hedgerow problem," Morrison interrupted. "Own it, Sergeant. You just changed the war." 7. Mass production and the legacy. Within days of the Rhinoceros combat success, every tank depot in Normandy received orders to begin installing Cullen hedgerow cutters. The Army brought in welding teams from engineering battalions. They scavenged more Czech hedgehogs from the beaches. They set up assembly lines in fields, working around the clock. Cullen found himself pulled from his unit and assigned to train welding crews. He went from depot to depot, showing them the exact angles for the prongs, the proper welding techniques, and the reinforcement methods that would keep the cutters from snapping off under stress. The key, he'd explain to each new group of welders, is that the prongs have to dig in low. If they're too high, the tank tilts up and exposes its belly. Too low, and they just plow dirt without cutting roots. You want them positioned exactly here. He'd mark the spot with chalk, at a 15-degree downward angle. That gives you optimal cutting action. General Omar Bradley visited one of the modification sites personally. He found Cullen elbow-deep in a welding project, training a new crew. "Sergeant Cullen, I presume." Cullen snapped to attention, recognizing the stars on Bradley's collar. "Yes, sir." At ease, Sergeant. I came to see the man who unstuck my army. Bradley smiled. Your invention is brilliant in its simplicity. We've been throwing sophisticated engineering solutions at the hedgerow problem for weeks. Artillery barrages, explosive charges, modified dozers. Nothing worked consistently. And then you come along with scrap metal and a welding torch and solve it in 2 days. Sir, I just did what needed doing. That's what good soldiers do, Bradley finished. I'm recommending you for the Legion of Merit, and I'm also authorizing a field promotion to Technical Sergeant. This army needs more men who can think outside the box. The Cullen hedgerow cutters saw widespread use, and soldiers in the field began reporting back with suggestions and modifications. The cutter worked brilliantly, but there was always room for improvement. One particularly clever modification came from a tank crew in the 3rd Armored Division. They added a simple mechanism inspired by agricultural harrow equipment that automatically cleared debris from the prongs as the tank moved. This small change meant tanks could breach multiple hedgerows in succession without stopping to manually clear the cutters. Cullen immediately incorporated this improvement into his training. See, that's genius right there, he'd tell welding crews. I never thought about debris clearance. Some tanker in the field saw the problem and fixed it. That's how good engineering happens, iteratively, with input from the people actually using the product. The German response was interesting. At first, they seemed baffled by the sudden Allied ability to breach hedgerows. Captured after-action reports showed confusion. Enemy armor is now passing through hedgerows without exposing vulnerable areas. Unknown how this is being accomplished. Once they figured out what was happening, the Germans tried various countermeasures, but none of them consistently worked. The fundamental problem remained. The Cullen cutter allowed tanks to breach hedgerows while keeping their thick frontal armor facing the enemy. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, the hedgerow cutters had become standard equipment. New Sherman tanks rolling off production lines in the United States were being manufactured with cutter attachment points already welded in place. The field modification had become an official part of tank design. Cullen had literally changed how tanks were built. 8. The cost of innovation. As Allied forces pushed beyond Normandy, the hedgerow cutters saw less use for their original purpose. But tankers quickly discovered they had other applications nobody had anticipated. In urban warfare, the steel prongs proved excellent for smashing through brick walls and wooden barricades. Tank crews used them to breach buildings where German snipers had taken position. The psychological effect was devastating. The sound of a 30-ton tank crashing through a wall was enough to convince many German defenders to surrender rather than fight. During river crossings, crews found that the cutters provided additional traction when tanks had to climb muddy riverbanks. In winter warfare, cutters helped push through snowdrifts that would have otherwise bogged down vehicles. They acted like massive snowplows. The most unexpected application came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German forces had created extensive roadblocks using felled trees. Tank crews discovered that the hedgerow cutters could push aside or break through these tree obstacles, allowing armored columns to maintain momentum even when roads were blocked. One after-action report described a Sherman crew using their Cullen cutter to literally push a disabled German tank out of a narrow road, clearing the way for an entire American column to advance. Cullen, now a master sergeant and attached to an engineering evaluation team, traveled to different units to study these creative applications. I never imagined my hedge cutters would be used for all this, he wrote in a letter home. I just wanted to get through Norman hedgerows. But soldiers are creative. They'll use any tool for whatever purpose serves them. But not all the news was positive. There were costs and consequences that Cullen hadn't fully anticipated. The first cost was human. When tanks gained the ability to breach hedgerows rapidly, infantry commanders began using armor more aggressively. This led to some units being pushed into situations where they took casualties that better caution might have prevented. Cullen wrestled with this guilt. Did I give commanders a tool that made them overconfident? He wondered aloud to his chaplain. You gave them a tool that saved lives, the chaplain replied gently. What commanders chose to do with that tool, that's on them, not you. You can only try to create things that do more good than harm. There was also the matter of the German defenders. The hedgerow cutters had undoubtedly shortened the Normandy campaign, which saved Allied lives, but it also meant the German soldiers who might have survived a longer, more cautious Allied advance were instead killed in the more rapid push that the cutters enabled. "I killed people I never saw," he confided to Kowalski one evening. "Not directly, but my invention put tanks in positions where they could kill more effectively. I'm being decorated for that. Medals for making killing more efficient. It feels wrong somehow." "You know what feels wrong to me?" Kowalski said firmly. "Watching good men burn in tanks because we couldn't breach hedgerows without exposing ourselves. You stopped that. Yes, your invention killed Germans. That's what it's supposed to do. But it also saved Americans. More importantly, it shortened the war. Every day this war goes on, people die. Your invention helped end it faster. That saves lives on all sides, even if it doesn't feel like it." 9. The final act and the shocking twist. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The hedgerow cutters had played their part in the victory. By most estimates, they'd shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, possibly months. That acceleration had cascading effects: faster advance across France, quicker liberation of Paris, earlier crossing of the Rhine. Every day saved meant lives saved, resources conserved, suffering reduced. General Eisenhower himself had called it one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. Kulin received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and a commendation from the Supreme Allied Commander. He was promoted to Warrant Officer. But here is the shocking twist. 4 months after his ingenious invention saved the entire Normandy campaign, Sergeant Curtis Cullen was involved in a completely different battle in the Hürtgen Forest. And there, the genius mechanic stepped on a landmine, losing his leg. The man who had given the American armored divisions the ability to move with unprecedented speed and safety, the man who had helped ensure the survival of thousands of his fellow soldiers, was now a disabled veteran. A single, simple mine took away his physical mobility, a tragic irony for the man who had restored the mobility of an entire army. Cullen returned home to New Jersey in late 1945, carrying decorations and a limp, ready to leave the war behind. He went back to his old job, fixing cars and trucks in a small garage. He was good with machines, good at solving problems, good at seeing solutions others missed. But he never talked much about the hedgerow cutter. When customers or friends would ask about his war experiences, he'd deflect. "I was a mechanic, fixed tanks, nothing exciting." His wife, Margaret, once asked him why he was so reluctant to discuss his wartime achievements. "You are a genuine hero," she said. "You should be proud." "I'm proud of what I did," Kulin replied quietly. "But I'm not proud of what it was for. I made a tool that helped kill people. It saved American lives, which matters, but it was still about killing. I'd rather focus on fixing things now, not on how I helped break things." 10. The simple genius. Over the decades, military historians gradually recognized the true significance of the Kulin hedgerow cutter. It appeared in books and documentaries, and in military training manuals as an example of field expedient engineering. In 1984, a young historian named David Carter tracked down Kulin, now 73 years old and long retired. "Mr. Cullen, do you understand how significant your invention was?" Carter asked during their interview. "Military analysts estimate it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks. It saved thousands of lives. It changed tank warfare doctrine. And it all came from you, a sergeant with no engineering degree, in just 48 hours. Cullen was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that Carter would include in his book as the perfect summary of American ingenuity. "I wasn't special. I was just a guy who knew how machines worked and saw a problem that needed solving. The special part was that the Army gave me a chance to try. How many other good ideas got dismissed because they came from the wrong person? How many problems went unsolved because someone said, 'That's not how we do things'? I got lucky. My crazy idea got tested, but I guarantee you there were 100 other guys with equally good ideas that nobody listened to." "But your idea worked," Carter pressed. "That makes you special." "My idea worked because people gave it a chance," Kulin corrected. "Captain Morrison could have said no. The test crew could have refused. Division could have rejected it after the first combat trial. But they didn't. They looked at the idea. not at who was suggesting it. That's the real lesson. Not that I was some genius, but that good ideas can come from anywhere, if you are willing to listen. Curtis G. Cullen III died in 1963. Most of his neighbors never knew that the old man who'd fixed their cars had changed the course of World War II. But in military museums across America and Europe, examples of the Cullen hedgerow cutter are preserved. Chunks of steel welded to the front of Sherman tanks, simple and crude-looking, but revolutionary in their effectiveness. And occasionally, a plaque mentions the name Curtis Cullen, the mad mechanic who refused to accept that problems were unsolvable.